Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. In this time of COVID-19, climate chaos, and historic elections, you count on Democracy Now! To stay focused on the issues that matter most. We count on you to support our independent journalism. If everyone who tunes in to Democracy Now! Gave just $10, we could cover our operating costs for 2021. Really, that's all it would take. Please do your part today by visiting us at democracynow.org. Stay safe. Wear a mask, save lives. And thank you so much. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
270 million people are marching towards starvation. Failure to address their needs will cause a hunger pandemic which will dwarf the impact of COVID.
As global hunger surges amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Food Program is awarded the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. We'll hear part of WFP head David Beasley's acceptance speech, then look at Joe Biden's decision to pick Tom Vilsack to head the U.S. Department of Agriculture again, then to Ethiopia.
The situation in Ethiopia is, I think, is really worrying and volatile, and as I had warned, it's spiraling out of control with appalling impact on civilians.
The Ethiopian government's blocking international observers into Tigray after Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched a military offensive that's displaced tens of thousands of civilians. It was just a year ago today that the Ethiopian Prime Minister won the Nobel Peace Prize.
I truly believe peace is a way of life, war a form of death and destruction.
Is Ethiopia now on the verge of a civil war? All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States recorded 3,124 COVID-19 deaths Wednesday, shattering every daily world record since the pandemic began. 107,000 people across the United States are hospitalized with the disease, also a record, and more than 220,000 new infections were reported in just 24 hours. More than a third of U.S. residents live in areas where intensive care units have either filled to capacity or are running critically short of ICU beds. Forecasts published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention predict as many as 23,000 new COVID-19 hospitalizations a day could follow the Christmas holiday weekend unless public health measures like social distancing and mask wearing are widely adopted. In Alabama, former Republican State Senator Larry Dixon died Saturday of COVID-19 at the age of 78. His widow, who also tested positive, reported her husband's last words were, "We messed up. We let our guard down. Please tell everybody to be careful. This is real. And if you get diagnosed, get help immediately," he said, and then died. On Capitol Hill, the House of Representatives approved a one-week extension of federal funding in order to give more time for lawmakers to reach agreement on a coronavirus relief bill. Senate Republicans have failed to pass a new stimulus package since the House passed the $3 trillion HEROES Act last May. Germany reported 25,000 coronavirus infections Wednesday, a record, with over 1,000 deaths in just the past 2 days. Chancellor Angela Merkel pleaded with Germans to limit social contacts over the holidays as she called for a new lockdown to stop the spread of COVID-19.
Es tut mir leid, aber es tut mir wirklich im Herzen leid.
It hurts me. It really aches in my heart. But if the price of these niceties is that our fatalities are now at 590 people a day, then this is not acceptable. And so we have to tighten this.
The German chancellor's plea came as several European countries hard hit by a fall wave of COVID-19 have shown significant progress flattening their infection curves after reimposing tough new lockdown measures. In the United Kingdom, regulators have warned hospitals against administering the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine to people with a history of strong allergies after 2 people had reactions to their jabs on Tuesday, the first day of vaccinations in Britain and Northern Ireland. The UK has enough doses of Pfizer's vaccine for 800,000 people and has ordered enough to vaccinate 20 million more people. Meanwhile, Canada's approved Pfizer's vaccine and could begin immunizations as soon as next week. In the U.S., a Food and Drug Administration Vaccine Advisory Committee is holding an all-day meeting today to review the Pfizer vaccine. Depending on how the committee votes, the first U.S. doses could be delivered on Friday. Here in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo promised state officials will not share the immigration status of vaccine recipients with the federal government. Cuomo said, quote, if undocumented people don't get vaccinated, it compromises their health and it compromises the whole program, unquote. In the United Arab Emirates, health officials say a large clinical trial of China's Sinopharm vaccine shows the 2-dose vaccine is 86% effective at preventing COVID-19 and appears entirely effective at preventing severe disease. Public health officials reviewing the claims caution they need more information about how the vaccine trial was conducted. Attorneys general from 46 states joined the Federal Trade Commission Wednesday in a pair of antitrust lawsuits against Facebook, saying the social media giant used its monopoly power to crush smaller rivals and snuff out competition. The lawsuits call on Facebook to spin off WhatsApp and Instagram and are demanding limits on future mergers and acquisitions by Facebook. New York Attorney General Letitia James announced the state's lawsuit Wednesday.
By using its vast troves of data and money, Facebook has squashed or hindered what the company perceived as potential threats. They've reduced choices for consumers. They stifled innovation, and they degraded privacy protections for millions of Americans.
President-elect Joe Biden has selected Katherine Tai to serve as U.S. Trade Representative. If confirmed by the Senate, who is Asian American, will become the first woman of color to hold the cabinet-level post. As the top lawyer for the Ways and Means Committee, she pressed the Trump administration for stronger labor protections in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement on Trade. She also prosecuted several U.S. disputes against China at the World Trade Organization. In related news, Joe Biden has formally nominated retired 4-star Army General Lloyd Austin to be Defense Secretary. Austin, who would make history as the first black defense secretary, spoke alongside Biden Wednesday.
America is strongest when it works with its allies. And over the years, I've worked hand in hand with our diplomatic colleagues and partners around the globe and witnessed firsthand what we're able to accomplish together.
Austin now serves on the board of the leading defense contractor Raytheon as a partner in the venture capital fund Pine Island Capital, alongside Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. Austin can only be confirmed if he secures a waiver from Congress due to laws designed to preserve the civilian control of the military. Several Democratic senators, including Richard Blumenthal, Tammy Duckworth, John Tester, and Elizabeth Warren, have indicated they would oppose granting a waiver to Austin. Blumenthal said, quote, a waiver of the 7-year rule contravenes the basic principle that there should be civilian control of a non-political military, unquote. 3 years ago, 17 Democratic senators voted against giving a waiver to General James Mattis when he was nominated by President Trump. The Trump administration appears set to move ahead with a $23 billion arms deal with the United Arab Emirates after a bipartisan effort in the Senate to block the deal failed. Critics said the arms deal could further destabilize the Middle East and worsen the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The deal includes the sale of F-35 fighter jets, Reaper drones, and other military equipment made by Raytheon and other U.S. weapons manufacturers. Philippe Nassif of Amnesty International criticized the arms deal, saying, quote, "Today's vote could be the first act in a domino effect which ends in human tragedy as this country provides capabilities which risk being used to injure and kill thousands of Yemenis and Libyans in their homes, their schools, and their hospitals." In Iraq's Kurdistan region, at least 8 people have been killed over the past week as security forces clamp down on protests over unpaid salaries. The semi-autonomous region is facing a financial crisis tied to corruption and a plunge in oil prices due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In eastern Afghanistan, gunmen shot and killed television journalist Malala Maiwand as she was on her way to work in the city of Jalalabad Thursday, making her at least the 10th Afghan media worker killed this year. Maiwand's driver was also killed in the assassination. No group has claimed responsibility, and the Taliban has denied involvement. In Ghana, the incumbent president, Nana Akufo-Addo, was announced the winner of a contested election, which has led to at least 5 people being killed in related violence since Monday. Earlier today, Ghana's opposition rejected the election results and vowed to take steps to overturn it. It was the 3rd time President Akufo-Addo faced off against former President John Mahama for the presidency. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, warns in a stark new report that greenhouse gas emissions have radically transformed the Arctic in just the last 15 years. The 2020 Arctic Report Card warns of dwindling sea ice, accelerating Arctic wildfires, summertime temperatures topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and rapidly melting permafrost that's releasing vast quantities of heat-trapping methane gas. On the whole, the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the globe. The state of New York has announced plans to divest its $226 billion retirement fund from most fossil fuel companies. The New York State Common Retirement Fund is the 3rd largest public pension fund in the United States. New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli said the fund would divest from the riskiest oil and gas companies by 2025 and decarbonize by 2040. The decision follows years of organizing by the Divest New York campaign, which was launched after Hurricane Sandy. Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, hailed the decision.
This is one of the really great, important moments. This is the biggest pension fund to divest yet. It comes from the state that is at the heart of the global financial system. That is, it is smart money. And it comes after the long effort of the comptroller to engage with these oil companies and try to knock some sense into them.
President Trump has asked the Supreme Court to side with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton in a lawsuit to overturn Joe Biden's election victory. Paxton sued the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin and has asked the Supreme Court to block the states from voting in the Electoral College. 17 Republican attorneys general have backed Paxton's extraordinary lawsuit. Trump's last-ditch effort to overturn the election results come as Paxton and several other Republican attorneys general are set to meet with Trump for a private luncheon today at the White House. All 50 states and the District of Columbia have now certified their presidential election results. On Monday, Electoral College voters will meet in their respective states to formally cast their votes for president. President Trump's top campaign attorney, Rudy Giuliani, left Georgetown University Hospital in Washington Wednesday after 4 days of treatment for COVID-19. Giuliani told New York radio station WABC he received the same drugs President Trump got during his battle with the coronavirus in October. Giuliani's special treatment followed similar care administered to Trump allies Chris Christie and Ben Carson, both of whom received experimental antibody therapies for severe cases of COVID-19. The drugs drugs produced by Eli Lilly and Regeneron are in such short supply that many states and hospital systems have set up a lottery system to determine who will receive them. Meanwhile, Jenna Ellis, another Trump campaign attorney who worked in close contact with Giuliani, has tested positive for COVID-19. Federal officials are investigating Hunter Biden, focusing on his taxes and business dealings in China. Investigators had not disclosed any new information about the probe until recently because of Justice Department guidelines barring overt actions that could affect an election. Hunter Biden maintains he has done nothing wrong. In Minnesota, the Minneapolis City Council passed a budget today that redirects about $8 million from the police department. The funds will go towards violence prevention, mental health response, and other services, but does not reduce the number of police officers and maintains new hiring targets after Mayor Jacob Frey threatened to veto any staffing reductions. The budget is a far cry from the City Council's pledge this summer to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department at the height of the racial justice protests following the police killing of George Floyd. In California, the freshly sworn-in Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon announced plans for sweeping changes to LA's criminal justice system during his inaugural address this week. Gascon called for ending the death penalty, ending cash bail for minor offenses, and reducing the prison population by quickly resentencing prisoners who are serving excessive terms. He also promised to end harsh penalties for children arrested for minor drug offenses.
Most kids experiment with drugs. But the painful truth is that the disadvantaged kids that get caught tend to go to juvenile hall, while kids in wealthier communities tend to go to rehab.
George Gascon is a former police officer who previously served as the district attorney of San Francisco. He ran as the progressive alternative to 8-year incumbent Jackie Lacey, who critics say too often sided with police and had come under fire more recently after her husband pulled a gun on Black Lives Matter protesters earlier this year. Johns Hopkins, the 19th century businessman and namesake of the prestigious hospital and university in Baltimore, Maryland, enslaved at least 4 black people before the Civil War. The revelation made by school officials this week was based on newly unearthed census documents and counters the popular narrative that Hopkins was an abolitionist. In other education news, Connecticut has become the first state to require high schools offer courses on African-American, Black, Puerto Rican and Latinx studies starting in 2022. Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont said, quote, increasing the diversity of what we teach is critical to providing students with a better understanding of who we are as a society and where we are going, he said. And in breaking news, a judge in Lebanon has charged Lebanese caretaker Prime Minister Hassan Diab and 3 former ministers with negligence in connection with the devastating August 4th explosion at the port of Beirut. The explosion killed over 200 people, injured 7,000, and left more than 250,000 Beirut residents homeless. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Nermeen Shaikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, just before our live broadcast today, the World Food Program received the Nobel Peace Prize in an online ceremony due to COVID-19 restrictions for what the Nobel Committee described as its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace and conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict, unquote. The World Food Program is the world's largest humanitarian organization dealing with hunger and food security. It's now warning the combination of conflict, climate crisis, and COVID-19 could push 270 million people to the brink of starvation. The executive director, the former South Carolina Governor David Beasley, accepted this year's Nobel Peace Prize award on behalf of the organization from its headquarters in Rome.
On behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, our board, our sister agencies, our incredible partners and donors, and on behalf of 19,000 peacemakers at the World Food Program, including those who came before us and especially those who died in the line of duty and their families who carry on, and on behalf of the 100 million people we serve, to the Norwegian Nobel Committee, thank you for this great honor. Also, thank you for acknowledging our work of using food to combat hunger, to mitigate against destabilization of nations, to prevent mass migration, to end conflict, and to create stability and peace. We believe food is the pathway to peace. I wish today that I could speak of how working together we can end world hunger for all the 690 million people who go to bed hungry every night, but today we have a crisis at hand. This Nobel Peace Prize is more than a thank you. It is a call to action. Because of so many wars, climate change, the widespread use of hunger as a political and military weapon, and a global health pandemic that makes all of that exponentially worse, 270 million people are marching towards starvation. Failure to address their needs will cause a hunger pandemic which will dwarf the impact of COVID. And if that's not bad enough, out of that 270 million, 30 million depend on us 100% for their survival. How will humanity respond? What tears me up inside is this. This coming year, millions and millions and millions of my equals, my neighbors, your neighbors, are marching to the brink of starvation. We stand at what may be the most ironic moment in modern history. On the one hand, after a century of massive strides in eliminating extreme poverty, today those 200 million of our neighbors are on the brink of starvation. That's more than the entire population of Western Europe. On the other hand, there's $400 trillion of wealth in our world today. Even at the height of the COVID pandemic, in just 90 days, an additional $2 trillion of wealth was created. And we only need $5 billion to save 30 million lives from famine. What am I missing here? A lot of my friends and leaders around the world have said to me, you've got the greatest job in the world, saving the lives of millions of people. Well, here's what I tell them. I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed weeping over the children we could not save. And when we don't have enough money, nor the access we need, we have to decide which children eat and which children do not eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job? Please, don't ask us to choose who lives and who dies. In the spirit of Alfred Nobel, as inscribed on this medal, peace and brotherhood, let's feed them all. Food is the pathway to peace.
Food is the pathway to peace. That's World Food Program Executive Director David Beasley accepting this year's Nobel Peace Prize award on behalf of the organization from its headquarters in Rome on today, International Human Rights Day. When we come back, we look at the hunger crisis with Ricardo Salvador of the Union of Concerned Scientists. We'll also ask him about President-elect Biden's pick to head the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which could play a key role in feeding millions of Americans facing food insecurity during the pandemic. And then we'll look at the crisis in Ethiopia. Stay with us.
Come round by our side and we'll sing you a song. So softly, let's do no one will so softly on Birmingham Sunday. The blood red like wine, like wine, and the choir kept singing of freedom.
Richard Farina's Birmingham Sunday, performed by the University of California Riverside Chamber Singers, arranged for chorus by Gene Glickman. Lifelong activist and music professor, Gene passed away last weekend at the age of 86. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. We look now at the growing hunger crisis and how the World Food Program, this year's Nobel Peace Prize recipient, projects 270 million people may be pushed to the brink of starvation amidst the combination of conflict, climate crisis, and COVID-19. Here in the United States, the group Feeding America predicts more than 50 million people in the country could experience food insecurity before the end of the year, including 1 in 4 children. We're joined now by Ricardo Salvador, Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you start, Ricardo, by responding to the World Food Program winning the Nobel Peace Prize today and the comments of its director, David Beasley, saying food is the pathway to peace?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is a very apt recognition for the organization. However, I think that Executive Director Beasley would also agree that the best circumstance would be that there be no need for an organization like the World Food Program. What it is doing is heroic because it's essentially delivering emergency food to populations that have no recourse. But we really need to be asking ourselves, how is it that in the 21st century, when the planet as a whole is producing almost half again as much in terms of calories that we need to feed everyone, that there are some people that are in such dire circumstances as he described. So we must always do that work. We must support that work. We must congratulate the people that devote their lives to do that. But I think a more important calling is actually to prevent the incidence of hunger on the planet, which is entirely doable. And to your question, the formula that food is the way to derive peace actually should be more properly understood in reverse. The answer to my question of why we have so many hungry people on the planet when there is no need for that is that it is a deliberate decision that some human beings make in order to appropriate the resources of others, or as in the case of one of the hotspots on the planet right now for hunger, which is Yemen. It was a deliberate strategy to disrupt the food system, specifically to weaken the country in the pursuit of the war between proxies, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so it's important to remember that hunger does not always happen because of natural disasters, which is a mental model that most of us fall back upon. It is often the result of things that we actually do to each other deliberately.
Ricardo, also today when Beasley was speaking, the head of the World Food Program, he said that food is the pathway to peace. He's also pointed out in a piece in The Guardian that even before the pandemic, in 2019, twice as many children died of malnutrition and hunger than have died in total from the pandemic so far. That is, over 3 million children died last year from hunger and malnutrition. Can you talk about what you think the underlying causes of this are? You hinted at it earlier. What are the problems with the global food system that creates this kind of systemic hunger in certain places?
Yeah, I'd be happy to lay that out. The most important thing to understand about the modern food system is that it is a creation of about the last 70 years. And it is a business model. It is a wonder of global logistics, and it is not a philanthropy. It costs a great deal to invest in the production, the processing, the distribution, the transportation, logistics, all of the blinking lights that make it so that for those of us that have economic and political power, that food system can serve our needs. It literally can deliver on our whims in an instant. Most of us, per deliberate strategy of the food system, are just within arm's reach of anything that it can manufacture and deliver. But note the qualifications that I just described. You need to have economic and political power in order to make that food system serve you. Now, that system does not serve everyone. When we cite statistics like the ones that we've been hearing this morning about the millions who are hungry, Another way of hearing that is to say the global food system that relies on wealthy people to be able to interact with it actually does not serve hundreds of millions of people on the planet. And the reason why these people are not served is that you provide your food in one of two ways. It's very simple. You either grow it and produce it for yourself, meaning that you have access to land and you can apply your labor and entrepreneurship to produce your own food, or else you generate cash income from some other activity and you interact with a global food system that does it all for you. If you're hungry, then it means you have no access to land, or else you're not able to apply your entrepreneurship to produce your own food. And you also don't have access to the capital, to the cash that's required to be able to interact with the food system. So the questions are, why is it that some people are not able to produce in their own backyards, on their own land, enough to feed themselves? And the answer to that is that often it's the folks interacting with the food system, that second category of people that I mentioned, that are the explanation. Those of us that enjoy cocoa, coffee, tea, the products of most of the tropical part of the world are actually utilizing tropical land, are actually utilizing the resources of other people. In our mind, we believe in such theories as comparative advantage. We're actually trading for these artifacts. But in fact, what is happening is that most of the time we're appropriating the resources of very vulnerable, economically desperate people that are not able to fight back against millionaires that are investing in land leases in order to produce industrial crops such as jatropha for biofuels, or to produce the luxury crops of the global north. And so it's very important to understand that, as I mentioned at the outset, these are deliberate human decisions, tactics that look like investment decisions to other people, but in fact actually have the perverse result of immiserating and making other people hungry in different parts of the planet.
Ricardo, could you talk about that actually in the context of what David Beasley also said, these staggering figures, $400 trillion of wealth in the world today, an additional $2.7 trillion added over just 90 days at the height of this pandemic. The connection between inequality and the kind of resource appropriation that you've been speaking of.
Yeah. I'll add a few more statistics to that. So, for instance, globally, the value of the food system approaches $5 trillion. It is a very high value add business proposition to take the raw products that most of us wouldn't know what to do with. So, for instance, raw corn, raw soybean, or livestock on the hoof, and turn that into the edible bites that most of us expect from the food system that we're accustomed to. Those of us that have only known the food system of the last 70 years know only those edible bites by and large. And so it's a very profitable system, and that nearly $5 trillion that I've described says things are going to stay this way. And so this means that people on the planet who are displaced, who formerly own land and produce for themselves, but have been displaced for banana plantations, for cocoa plantations, for tea plantations, for bioenergy plantations, and so on. These are populations of people that do not have the political power, often don't enjoy the support of their own governments in order to assure their food sovereignty and their own well-being. Prime example of this is the continent of Africa. The majority of us are accustomed to grab for a stereotypical image of somebody suffering from hunger by going on to the internet and finding images of desperate people on the African continent. We're conditioned by those images to think of the continent as a basket case when it comes to economic development and to agricultural production. The continent of Africa not only could feed itself, it is currently producing more calories than needed to feed its own population. Just one country, Sudan, could be a breadbasket for the entire continent. But what is actually occurring is that governments are making land lease deals with foreign companies or other nations, namely China, so that the production of Africa is literally appropriated to meet the needs of other countries that have the capital to compete for that land and for the production of that land against the interests of native Africans. And so this is just another instance of the principle that I keep repeating, that hunger does not just happen to people. It isn't just that climate change has occurred. It isn't just that there's been a temporary catastrophe such as a typhoon, a hurricane. It is that we deliberately make decisions to deprive other folks of the factors of production that they require to take care of one of their prior needs, which is to provide for their nourishment. So it's a matter of power. It's a matter of whether there's actual democracy for people to be able to fight for their own rights within their own countries. And so the abstract notion of hunger can be translated into very deliberate power plays that we all can interact with, that we all can shift.
Ricardo Salvador, what can the pandemic teach us about treating hunger?
Well, the pandemic is an instance of a disruption that has been global in this particular instance, but let's go to one of the hotspots of hunger in the world right now that I've mentioned already, the country of Yemen. It is a civil war that is a proxy war being fought by Iran and Saudi Arabia. It has gone on for 5 years. The United States is a part of this war on the side of Saudi Arabia, backing Saudi Arabia, providing armaments, providing moral justification. It is a country that would not be able to provide for its own food. It is primarily a desert country, so 80% of its food is imported. If you disrupt the economic system there, as the war had done prior to the pandemic, then that means that people are going to be vulnerable. There will be no actual flow of food. But the pandemic has actually exacerbated that to the point where essentially the 85% of food that has to be imported to meet the demand of the internal population has been disrupted just logistically. Just because of the war, the food cannot get in. And so there are two ways that you don't have access to food. One is the one that I just described, physical access. And I've given you an example of a place where decisions made by people, let's go to war and let's specifically disrupt the food system of Yemen so that it can be vulnerable and we can win the war there. So an intentional act. Or the other way that you cannot have access is because you don't have the capital, you don't have the cash. And so the fundamental thing to remember always in these situations is you must provide access so that people can actually meet their own needs. And one of those two ways. The pandemic itself has actually exacerbated existing vulnerabilities all over the planet, where people were on the razor's edge of food sovereignty and survivability. Often this has tipped them over the edge. And it has occurred not only in the global south, it is actually something that exists within the global north. So there are populations the size of, say, Sudan, 50 million total population. That is the number of food insecure people embedded within the United States.
I wanted to look now, speaking of the United States, at how President-elect Joe Biden's pick to head the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, could play a major role in that issue of hunger, feeding millions of Americans facing food insecurity during the pandemic, and how the incoming administration responds to the climate crisis. Ricardo Salvador, you recently co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times headlined, "Goodbye USDA, Hello Department of Food and Well-Being." You wrote this before Biden's pick former Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack as his Secretary of Agriculture, instead of Ohio Congressmember Marcia Fudge, who he chose to head Housing and Urban Development. Environmental and civil rights groups had urged Biden to pick Fudge, who's African-American, to head the USDA, citing her dedication to preserving its anti-hunger programs like SNAP, that Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which makes up about half the budget. As many as 1 in 4 Americans use at least one of USDA's food aid programs. Fudge's supporters included South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn, another key backer of Biden during the primaries, who said, quote, "It's one thing to grow food, but another to dispense it. And nobody would be better at that than Marcia Fudge." But Biden chose Vilsack, who became CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council after he left government, a group backed by the dairy industry. If you, Ricardo Salvador, could talk about the significance of the USDA and what has been Vilsack's role. I mean, he ran it throughout the Obama 2-term tenure.
Yeah. Well, the first note that I should make is that it's been reported widely in the media that that will be the pick of the administration. I want to note that there's been no official announcement of that, so that there's still hope that that decision could be influenced. But to your point, there would be implications of this. We are living in a historical moment. It isn't just that the pandemic that we've been discussing has disrupted the food system as well as other systems across the planet. It's that we're also in the middle of an attack on democracy around the planet. It is also that we are living at a time when the public at large is beginning to doubt the foundations of modernity, which is the scientific approach to things. And also, we're at a time where there is a massive racial reckoning, which is connecting the history, the foundations of today's modern economies to exploitation. And at this historical moment, any change in administration is an opportunity to strike in a new direction. So obviously, going back to a secretary of the past is not the way to strike in a new direction. That is status quo. And I need to be clear that while I acknowledge that is a very difficult job, and Secretary Vilsack did as good a job as one could expect during the time that he was in, the blemishes in his administration have to do with the issues that have to change about the department. There was manipulation of data and reports that his administration issued purporting that African farmers had been better served during his administration. We now know that was not true. And by the way, the significance of this is that this is a department that has actually had to settle legal lawsuits for billions of dollars, acknowledging that they have actively discriminated against African American, Native American, Latinx, and women farmers and ranchers. Who does that leave? That they've been preferentially serving since it being established in 1862. The farming population in the United States is dominantly white. It's unnaturally white. It's 96% white. And so in the 21st century, you can't have an institution with the profile of serving preferentially a very small sliver of the entire population. Its original remit was to be a people's department, and this was at a time, 1862, the date of its founding, when the majority of the population were rural, and when there was a significant number of people that derived their livelihood from farming itself. So it did make sense that at that time, your primary stakeholders would be farmers. But it's 2021. In the United States, nominally 2 million farmers still ply that trade. We all depend on them, but the country is 320 million people. And we all have a stake in the food system. It determines whether we're healthy or not. It determines whether we're susceptible to diseases like the COVID pandemic and so on. So the stakeholders in USDA are all of us. That A doesn't stand for agribusiness, which is the way that secretaries of agriculture normally behave. And this is a secretary, Mr. Vilsack, whom I respect, but who has come from 4 years of working for agribusiness, as you just noted. And so that's not the profile of somebody that is going to be able to be independent of agribusiness and serve a much broader set of public interests, which you've listed. We all have a stake in having physical and economic access to a nourishing system that is equitable, not only in terms of who gets to eat, but also in terms of who gets to farm, who gets to participate in the business of food and agriculture.
And Ricardo, before we conclude, you point out in that New York Times piece the question of food insecurity in the U.S. 10% of households were already food insecure before the pandemic. That number has now doubled. You also say that nearly 75% of Americans are clinically overweight or obese, making them, of course, more vulnerable to COVID-19 in addition to other health problems. So could you, explain the difference between food insecurity and hunger, and what this phenomenon in America, which is, of course, in the U.S., the richest country in the world, what it reveals about the food system here and the failures of the USDA as it's been constituted?
Yeah, clinically, you're suffering from hunger when you have caloric deficiency or some other nutrient deficiency that is affecting your ability to thrive. It will stunt the growth of children, for instance, and this is one of the ways in which we actually measure that hunger is occurring. However, food insecurity is rampant and has just as profound an effect. We define that as basically the percentage of your time that you spend worrying about where your next meal is going to come from. And if you're in that population, then obviously this is going to take major mind share, and you will not be able to flourish because the primary concern is how you're going to be able to meet your nutritional needs, your food needs. And so the fact that in a wealthy country like the United States, we should have prior to the pandemic, about 10% of the population, and now about 20% of the population that are dealing with food insecurity should be a national shame. This situation just should not occur. Now, what it reveals, in answer to your question, has to do with who these people are. When you look at who they are, one of the things that you discover is that they are disproportionately what in the United States we call the people of color. This means other than the descendants of Northern Europeans that settled the country a few hundred years ago. Just to summarize almost glibly a lot of history, what this population distribution represents is that the modern structure of the nation, its laws, its government, its business models, were essentially set up for those settlers and their descendants, and everybody else here has a history of either having been here and being displaced or else having been brought here in order to perform brutal menial labor. And so some set of the population over generations has been having access to land, access to government programs, access to credit, access to the best education, and building their wealth and well-being. And another set of the population has experienced exactly the opposite of that, being driven off of land, their ancestors experiencing genocide, people not having access to government programs, to loans, credits, to real estate. They only get access to second-grade education or second-rate education. And so therefore what that means is they are losing wealth across the generations. So if you go back to the formula for hunger that I described earlier, this tracks poverty. And so the poor people in the United States are disproportionately people of color. The white poverty rate in the United States, again, prior to the pandemic, runs about 9%. The poverty rate among people of color in the United States is double of that, at least double of that. And so this is where you find primarily the majority of the hungry people in the United States. It has to do with the history of the nation. And as I mentioned earlier, we're living at a moment in racial reckoning, and we need to overcome that history by directly addressing the inequities that make some of us poor and therefore make some of us especially susceptible to food insecurity and to hunger. I'll just repeat. These are the results of actual human decisions to appropriate somebody else's land, to kill people, to drive them into reservations, to enslave people, to make some people who are essential for the food system to work undocumented so that we can exploit them and abuse them. And these are things that we can change and that we must change.
Well, this is an ongoing conversation. And Ricardo Salvador, thanks so much for being with us, Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Recently co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times, which we will link to, headlined, "Goodbye USDA. Hello, Department of Food and Well-Being." Up next, our guest says Ethiopia is on the verge of a civil war. We'll talk about what's happening in the Tigray region. Stay with us.
We are playing Midnight Mary. My turn to sleep in the cemetery. The last flicker of this lighter is the only flame I have. My parents think I'm sleeping at Jackie's. Her parents think she's sleeping at mine. It's a year before my dad will leave, and my mom will wear sunglasses all the time. I'm not afraid of seeing ghosts in the night. I'm not afraid of the boogeyman running his hands down my spine. I'm only afraid of the kind of darkness that doesn't end.
When the Sun Comes Up by Greta Morgan. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh, A year ago today, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the 2-decade state of war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, with many hailing a new era of peace in the region. We turn now to look at how just 1 year later, Abiy Ahmed's military has displaced tens of thousands of civilians in the ongoing military campaign in the northern Tigray region. Thousands have died since Ethiopia declared war on the Tigray People's Liberation Front more than a month ago. At least one massacre has been reported. Earlier this week, Ethiopia rejected calls for an independent investigation into the violence, with a top government official saying Ethiopia, quote, doesn't need a babysitter. This comes amidst a communication blackout, and as Ethiopia admitted federal troops fired at and detained UN workers in the northern Tigray region for attempting to enter areas they say are forbidden. On Wednesday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, spoke out about the conflict, describing, quote, gross human rights violations.
The situation in Ethiopia is, I think, is really worrying and volatile, and as I had warned, it's spiraling out of control with appalling impact on civilians. In the Tigray region itself, fighting is reportedly continuing, in spite of government claims to the contrary. Elsewhere in Ethiopia, there are numerous reports of ethnic profiling of Tigrayans, including in Addis. We have reports of dismissal from jobs, including in the civil service, harassment of Tigrayan journalists, and hate speech against Tigrayans.
Well, for more, we go to London, where we're joined by Ewala, Associate Professor at Keele University School of Law in the United Kingdom, Global Fellow at Princeton University. In 2019, he nominated Abiy Ahmed for the Nobel Peace Prize. His recent piece in Al Jazeera is headlined, How Abiy Ahmed's Ethiopia First Nationalism Led to Civil War. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. You have changed your views in this last year of the man you nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, who won it last year. Can you talk about the situation? The New York Times headline today on the front page says, finish him. Ethiopians on the run describe ethnic slaughter. Talk about what's happening.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Ethiopia, over the course of the last 2 years, moved from a moment of a very high degree of hope and optimism, a vision of transformation, into a total civil war that threatened to destabilize not only the country but also the broader Horn of Africa region. I think a number of people who saw the way in which things were changing in Ethiopia when the Prime Minister came into power had exactly the same views that I had, that this was a very transformational figure who is committed to the ideas of peace, of reconciliation, of justice, because he consistently talked about these ideas. He mobilized them, in literally every speech that he gave in the first 2 months of coming to office. And the, I think, commitment that he made to strike a deal of some sort with Eritrea to end the war, at that time, most of us thought that that was a very bold and revolutionary move that deserved recognition of some sort. But obviously there were, I think, with the benefit of the insight, we can say that there was a lot that we didn't know. There was a lot that I think the Prime Minister himself wasn't quite clear about in terms of some of the structural challenges and uncertainties facing the country. And I think the fact that an ideological and political difference between himself and his regime and the Tigray People's Liberation Front led to this war, I think, shows that it wasn't clear whether the Prime Minister actually had, as a principle, a policy of ruling out war and violence as a means of settling political dispute.
Could you give us some historical context for this conflict? I mean, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, they dominated for decades the ruling coalition in Ethiopia. They constitute only 6% of the population. What is the source and origin of the conflict between the Abiy central government and the Tigray people?
So the difference between the two is primarily political, in the sense that there was a struggle over power from the moment when the prime minister came to office, and then that difference over the course of time evolved into an ideological difference. So when the prime minister came to power on the back of the Oromo protest movement that catapulted him to the office of the prime minister, that meant that the hegemony that the ethnic Tigrayans or TPLF had in Ethiopian politics came to an end. And TPLF wasn't particularly happy with the way in which the prime minister changed some of the things, removed some officials of TPLF from power, particularly the fact that the federal government wanted some key members of TPLF to be held accountable for crimes of the past. So those political differences over the course of time evolved into an ideological difference. And this is something that most of us didn't know quite clearly, in the sense that the prime minister, when he came to power, he seemed to be someone who believed in the kind of multinational federal arrangements that existed at the time in the country, which was a kind of affirmative action system put into place to redress the inequities of the past. But as time progressed, as he consolidated more and more power, he signaled an intention to centralize power, to move towards a more unitary kind of system where regional governments, regional states would have less and less authority compared to the center. Now, TPLF, having been pushed from the center and now at the regional level, they wanted regional autonomy. So the fact that regional autonomy is threatened gave the TPLF an ideological kind of path in terms of taking on the federal government, because that is something that is supported by the vast majority of Ethiopia's people in the south, particularly the Oromos. So that is where the conflict between the two took on an ideological form. And then over the course of time, the prime minister dissolved the then ruling coalition, created his own party. The coalition that he dissolved is a coalition that is constituted of 4 ethnic-based parties. The party that he established in place of that coalition is what we may call a pan-Ethiopian party that does not have ethnic distinction within it. But it's a party at the same time that is incompatible with some of the predominant mode of political organizing and mobilization that existed in the country. So many people raise question as to the viability of that kind of structure, at least, especially its ability to win a democratic election. So when the prime minister established that new party, TPLF refused to join that party, and then the prime minister removed a few individuals who were part of his cabinet from TPLF from the cabinet. And then the prime minister, some months later, decided to postpone the election. When the election was postponed, TPLF said they will go ahead and hold the election because it's constitutionally mandated. The federal government withdrew recognition from the Tigray Liberation Front as a government of the Tigray region. And then the Tigray regional government also declared that it would not recognize the legitimacy of the federal government. So you can see how those differences over political and ideological differences led to a series of events ultimately leading to a military confrontation.
Now, right now, of course, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you talk about what the effect of the ongoing conflict has been on the healthcare system in the Tigray region? And of course, the fact that the highest profile Tigrayan abroad is the present head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who has been accused by Ethiopia's military chief of siding with the Tigray region.
I think, fortunately, the pandemic doesn't seem to be having the same level of impact that it is having here in the western part of the world. Maybe because this has to do with data issues, and this is a broader debate as to why the pandemic is not having the same impact in Africa as it is in the northern hemisphere. But the pandemic itself is really not something that is discussed much in the public domain. But the fact that this war has been prosecuted in the midst of a complete information blackout, and the fact that the hospitals and health centers in the Tigray regional states have not received any supplies and have been running out of emergency supplies, I think that is certainly having a considerable impact on the ability of health providers to provide to care for those who are badly in need, and that is the view that is being expressed by humanitarian agencies working specifically on healthcare issues, including the ICRC.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we will certainly continue to follow the situation. Awalo, Associate Professor at Keele University School of Law, speaking to us from London. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. Be safe, wear a mask.